Thank you so much for being here tonight. It's such an honor and a privilege to be part of this lecture series, and a real special treat for me to be back in town again. As some of you here may know, I used to live in Santa Barbara until my husband defected to Silicon Valley. And I've enjoyed a special relationship with the University of California at Santa Barbara since the early 1990s, when student interns assisted me with my research, and also when some of my papers were donated to CEMA, the California Ethnic and Multicultural Archives at UCSB. This town is associated with some of the warmest memories of my life, which is when my husband and I first moved out to California and I started my career as an author. I'm going to spend the better part of this hour talking about the Chinese in America, a narrative history, and then I'll devote some time to answering questions from the audience. The Chinese in America, as a history, could have been a very dry and chronological account, a story about a foreign people who came from a foreign land, focusing on foreign cultural customs that persisted or faded over the generations. But instead, I see this history as a history about America. It's the story about the successes and failures of the American democratic experiment. And the lessons learned by the Chinese in this country are remarkably timely and relevant today for all groups. In fact, the story of the Chinese in America was really not so different from the story of other immigrants who struggled for life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness, with each generation having to defend their civil liberties and their place in America. First, let me tell you a little about myself and why I wrote this book. For as long as I could remember, I lived in two separate realities as a Chinese American: the reality of popular culture and the reality of my own personal experience. Popular culture told me that Chinese Americans were hopelessly foreign and exotic and inscrutable. They were Fu Manchu, Charlie Chan, and Susie Wong. They were those buck-toothed cartoon figures with pigtails or lampshade hats on Saturday morning television. They were those 7 Chinese brothers from the popular children's book who could withstand fire and suffocation and swallow the sea in one gulp. They were obviously not American and perhaps not even human. And then there was the other reality I knew as the daughter of 2 professors in the university town of Champaign-Urbana, Illinois. Immigrant scholars from all over the globe, from regions like China and India and Europe and the Middle East. All of these immigrants converged on this little Midwestern community where they celebrated their ethnicity with campus-sponsored festivals and parties, while also working together to research important intellectual topics. My own high school, University High School, was almost like a little mini United Nations in its racial diversity. And many of my classmates they either came from or later engaged in interracial marriage, as I would when I reached adulthood. So during the most formative years of my life, I grew up with the perception that while mass American entertainment might be biased, a bias I attributed to ignorance, not necessarily malevolence, in real life, people can cherish their cultural heritage while also befriending each other and marrying each other across color lines, because that is what I saw and experienced every day in Champaign-Urbana. And I also believed, as many people did, that anti-Asian racism might one day become a relic of the past. For instance, all throughout the 1980s, the major news media carried optimistic stories about Chinese Americans winning Nobel Prizes and flooding the best universities in the country and acing the Westinghouse and National Merit Scholarship competitions. And the Chinese, as I remember, were called the model minorities. They were moving upwards and onward at an incredible pace. Of course, I knew there was some racism, even severe racism, in other regions of the U.S. A friend of mine who was half Chinese, half white, told me how her brother had a refrigerator dropped on him by bullies when they were living in the Dakotas, while a gorgeous Chinese-American broadcast journalist who grew up in a tiny factory town close to Champaign-Urbana reported being beaten up almost daily after school when she was in high school. Their tormentors told them to go back to China, even though they had grown up in the United States and they were born in the U.S. and they had lived in this country all their lives. But I figured that since the offenders were isolated and uneducated, I didn't really regard this at the time as a serious national problem. But by the late 1990s, something very serious was happening in the United States. A sudden anti-Chinese backlash with the full support of certain prominent members and of the government and the U.S. media. It happened shortly after the demise of the former Soviet Union, when the rise of the PRC as the world's second major superpower evoked fear and suspicion of China in the United States. For the first time in my life, I saw how the reality of popular culture collide with the reality of personal experience, a collision that literally destroyed lives in the process. In the absence of the previous Soviet threat, China was now a prime contender for America's new enemy. And many of you may recall that a Time magazine cover story implied that a new Cold War with China was on the horizon. And a deeply flawed report released by the Special Committee under Congressman Christopher Cox suggested that the PRC had been stealing nuclear secrets from the U.S. for decades. The result was a major anti-Chinese backlash in the United States and a hysterical search for Chinese spies in our national laboratories. The most visible victim of this, as many of you may remember, was Wen-Ho Lee, a Taiwanese-American scientist at Los Alamos National Laboratory, who was tragically scapegoated and accused of passing design secrets of the W-88 warhead to mainland China. After Wen-Ho Lee was fired without a hearing and threatened during government interrogations and then shackled and held under especially dreadful conditions in prison, the U.S. finally had to admit that it had no evidence that Lee committed espionage, and also revealed the very embarrassing fact that the W-88 technology that China allegedly had could not have come from Los Alamos. Lee was finally released as part of a plea bargain arrangement when the government failed to find proof he was a spy. Now, during the Lee controversy, Chinese-American scientists who had devoted years of their lives strengthening American defense with their technological research were being interrogated as if they were spies for the PRC. Some were being harassed simply for sending out their portable laptop computers to be fixed. Others were teased by their coworkers as potential secret agents or subjected to more official scrutiny by their bosses. And for many people of my parents' generation, this was really something entirely new and unexpected. Previously, the worst racist episodes against the Chinese seemed to come mainly from poor blue-collar areas, such as what happened to Vincent Chin or Jim Liu, who were killed in the streets by whites after confrontations in a strip club or pool hall. But now we were seeing an attack by highly sophisticated government agencies against a highly sophisticated strata of Chinese-American society, against their scientists and their engineers and their high-tech professionals. And for Chinese intellectuals who had always been supported by the U.S. government in scholarships and salaries and research grants, for those Chinese Americans who had spent their entire professional lives nurtured by our universities and our national laboratories, this was a very frightening development. We were concerned by the ease with which the media suddenly exploited cruel caricatures of the Chinese during the Lee case, engaging in an orgy of yellow journalism. Talk radio and television hosts lumped together all Chinese, ethnic Chinese, Chinese Americans, and also foreign Chinese nationals alike as potential spies. The Washington Post drew fantasies of millions of Chinese united by a nefarious master scheme to commit espionage. One article in the Post proclaimed that, quote, China's spying, they say, more typically involves cajoling morsels of information out of visiting foreign experts and tasking thousands of Chinese abroad to bring secrets home one at a time, like ants carrying grains of sand. The Chinese have been assembling such grains of sand since at least the 4th century BC, when the military philosopher Sun Tzu noted the value of espionage in his classic work, The Art of War. Even the New York Times faced criticism from within the organization and also from outsiders for its careless reporting of the Wenho Lee case. In the series of articles that started it all, the Times reported a mysterious $700 withdrawal that Lee had made from an American Express office in Hong Kong and speculated that he used it to buy an airplane ticket to Shanghai. It was later discovered, however, that the money had in fact been used by his daughter on a sightseeing tour outside of Hong Kong. Now, anti-Chinese feeling would only deepen after the Lee case. For example, in October 2000, the Republicans ran a television commercial suggesting that electing Al Gore for president might result in nuclear annihilation by the People's Republic of China. The commercial claimed that China had, quote, the ability to threaten our homes with long-range missiles because the Clinton-Gore administration had, quote, sold out the nation's securities to, quote, communist-red China in exchange for campaign contributions. The advertisement featured a little white girl plucking daisy petals as she counted backwards. Then her counting was abruptly followed by a countdown for a missile. And then a nuclear explosion. Don't take a chance, the commercial warned. Please vote Republican. This TV ad was a remake of the well-criticized 1964 Daisy commercial made for President Lyndon Johnson and implying that the views of his opponent, Barry Goldwater, would lead to an atomic war. And then, anti-Chinese sentiment flared again and climaxed in April 2001 when a Chinese fighter jet over the South China Sea, apparently flying too close to an American Navy spy plane on a U.S. routine surveillance mission, caused the American pilot to take sudden evasive action, resulting in a mid-air collision. And as many of you may remember, the Chinese pilot was killed, and the Chinese government detained 24 American crew members of the spy plane after they made an emergency landing to China's Hainan Island. After 11 days of tense negotiations and a carefully worded apology from the United States, the PRC released the crew. But by that time, the Chinese-American community had suffered a furious backlash from their fellow Americans. What troubled Chinese Americans during this period was that once again they were lumped together with events taking place in mainland China thousands of miles away. During the spy plane crisis, Teresa Ma, a Chinese American chemist in Lincoln, Nebraska, told me that a neighbor approached her and asked, "Why don't you go to China to bring our men home?" This neighbor could not figure out the difference between Chinese Americans and Chinese foreign nationals, despite the fact that many Chinese Americans were U.S. citizens whose families had lived here for generations. And the spy plane crisis also provoked some of the crudest stereotypes imaginable in the media. For example, Patrick Oliphant, a Pulitzer Prize-winning cartoonist, published a shocking and racist caricature of a Chinese man, complete with buck teeth and thick glasses, serving cat gizzards. The National Review complained that the Chinese, quote, put MSG in everything, end quote, and claimed, quote, if my dog were a member of the American crew, Jiang Zemin would have eaten him by now. Some members of the media even recommended the mass dismissal or expulsion or even imprisonment of the entire Chinese American community. A Fox News host called for Chinese employees to be fired from the national laboratories, and a national talk show host demanded that Chinese Americans be interned by the U.S. government as the Japanese Americans had been during World War II. In Springfield, Illinois, 2 radio DJs urged the boycott of all Chinese American restaurants, suggested that all Chinese Americans be shipped out of the country, and even telephoned people with Chinese last names to harass them on the air. Now, this shocked and hurt me deeply because Springfield, Illinois is not very far from where I grew up, and geographically even closer to my hometown of my husband. The region was filled with people that we knew and loved. So who were these talk show hosts, and why do they have such hatred for Chinese Americans? Well, my husband said, DJs say crazy things all the time, and it's their job to shock people. But then something even more repulsive came to my attention. I had spent the early part of my career working in newsrooms and had the highest respect for newspaper and wire service journalists. Their field, I believe, represents a marriage between literature and public service idealism. But even newspaper editors were indulging in anti-Chinese stereotypes during the spy plane crisis. Let me tell you what happened in April 2001 when Amy Liang, a Chinese-American college senior, was interning at the ASNI Reporter, a publication of the American Society of Newspaper Editors. The society organized a national convention in Washington, D.C., and Liang was assigned to photograph the performance of a comedy troupe during the opening reception. The troupe put on a skit about Chinese-U.S. relations, and I would like to read her description of the event. White males impersonated a Chinese official and his translator, she wrote. The official sported a black wig and thick glasses and spoke fake Chinese. Ching ching chong chong, the man shouted as he gestured wildly. What was disturbing was not just the fact that this was happening, but that hundreds of editors, my future bosses, were laughing. I felt myself swallowed by all of the loud laughter. Each time the Chinese voice became more jarring, the editors would laugh even harder. Despite feeling humiliated, I finished the job and turned in my pictures. The next morning, I woke up crying. It seemed as if the skit merely reflected the popular mood of the times. A 2001 Gallup poll found that more than 80% of Americans viewed the PRC as dangerous. In another poll, a national telephone survey commissioned by the Committee of 100 and the Anti-Defamation League found that close to half of the people polled thought that the Chinese Americans, quote, passing secrets to the Chinese government is a problem. Almost 1/3 of the people believed that Chinese Americans were more loyal to the PRC than to the U.S. But then something even more unexpected happened, the terrorist attacks of 9/11. Like many Americans, I watched with horror, absolute horror, the footage of the hijacked airplanes crashing into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. And then, just as quickly as the anti-Chinese backlash had arrived, it vanished. Suddenly, Middle Eastern immigrants were the new pariahs of American society. And so, as I wrote The Chinese in America, I tackled a number of provocative questions that are central not only to the Chinese-American experience, but the entire American immigrant experience, such as, how can an ethnic group that is embraced by America at certain times and celebrated for its hard work and its achievement suddenly find itself vilified? Why does it happen? How frequently does it happen? And how can we stop this from happening again? When you read my book, you'll find that the U.S., a country that prides itself as a bastion of fair play and justice, once shut the Chinese out from the gates of immigration and from the law, and even turned a blind eye to the wholesale slaughter of Chinese Americans across the American West more than a century ago. When I started this project, I shared the common perception that Chinese Americans started out poor and downtrodden at the very bottom of society, only to rise steadily to the top. But the reality is that the Chinese, like other ethnic groups, endured cycles of acceptance and abuse, wild swings between tolerance and xenophobia. At certain times in history, they were praised and celebrated as honorary whites, while at other times they were loathed and even killed. And their fate oscillated with factors beyond their control, such as political and economic conditions and the state of Sino-American relations. And their history is not a linear progression upwards, but rather a cyclical journey, as wild as any roller coaster ride. If I might summarize these cycles briefly, we can look at the history of the Chinese in the United States as a story of 3 major immigrant waves in the last 150 years, each of which has experienced great extremes of success and mistreatment. The first wave of Chinese, mostly men, came in the mid-19th century, the majority to join the California gold rush, but others immigrated directly to other regions. They were warmly welcomed when they first arrived because the U.S. needed their labor, especially during the Civil War. And as they filled this labor shortage, the Chinese made huge and unheralded contributions to this country, such as building the Transcontinental Railroad, transforming the western frontier into land for agriculture, laboring in factories and canneries during the American Industrial Revolution. But it may come as a surprise to you, as it did for me, of the degree to which some of the early Chinese were accepted in this country before their numbers grew too large to be a threat. On the East Coast, and especially in New York City, marriages between Chinese men and Irish women were frequent enough to provoke articles in the press and caricatures on the stage. Chinese immigrant intellectuals who studied and graduated from colleges in the Ivy League routinely married white women. Some Chinese even found acceptance in some of the most racist regions of the American South. For example, Chang and Ong Bunker, the famous Siamese twins who shared a liver and a 5-inch ligament of flesh connecting their torsos, settled down in Wilkesboro, North Carolina, where they married white women, fathered 21 children between them, and ran their own plantations, complete with 33 black slaves. Their 2 eldest sons enlisted in the Confederate Army during the Civil War. But the Chinese soon faced a backlash, especially in California, in this state. White Americans started to see them as a problem as the population of Chinese immigrants grew, especially during the economic depression of the 1870s, when white workers found it hard to compete effectively with Chinese capitalists and Chinese wage earners. And so in desperation, white workers organized among themselves politically against Chinese immigrants. And the ethnic Chinese soon found themselves demonized in the media, the subject of racist state legislation, and also being forced to pay more taxes and license fees in the state than any other group in California, while also not being permitted to vote or to use many of the government services that were sustained by their taxes. They could not testify against whites or work for a public corporation, and their children were the only group to be denied a state-funded education. And things only grew worse for the Chinese when California became a crucial swing state during presidential elections and political parties adopted anti-Chinese platforms to court the state of California. Washington found it convenient to scapegoat the Chinese and blame the nation's ills on the Chinese instead of having the public scrutinize their own corruption and acceptance of bribes and collusion with big industry. And so in 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which would shut the gates of immigration to the Chinese laborers for the next 60 years. Other laws passed over the next few decades would lock the Chinese out of the country, even if they had property and families in the United States, force the Chinese to register with the government for residential certificates, and deprive them of the protection of the courts and bail and habeas corpus cases, and threatened even their privileges associated with birthright citizenship. Anti-Chinese riots and massacres would also drive many of the Chinese out of small towns and cities across the American West, and thousands left for China never to return. And the remaining Chinese faced government harassment and repeated assaults against their civil liberties, such as arrests in the middle of the night, interrogations by immigration authorities, demands for bribes by corrupt officials, and threats of deportations in China. At one point, it was so bad that the Chinese in Providence, Rhode Island, were even forced to take the drapes away from the restaurants so they could be viewed from the outside at all times. And when a young white girl named Elsie Siegel was apparently murdered by her Chinese boyfriend in New York City, the police forbade any Chinese person to leave the city without permission, and across the country, the Chinese were just arrested indiscriminately whenever they stepped off trains or tried to buy steamship tickets. These episodes just show how quickly the constitutional rights of the Chinese could be suspended in an instant in any time of government-declared emergency. Now, this cycle of acceptance and abuse would be repeated for the Chinese in the 20th century during the second major wave of their immigration. The door to Chinese immigration opened up again after the exclusion laws were repealed following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, which led many people in the United States to see the Chinese Americans as the good guys during the Sino-American wartime alliance. Also, new legislation in the 1960s swept away the racist immigration quotas against Asian countries. Now, the second wave of immigration consisted largely of students and highly educated professionals, representing one of the great brain drains of Chinese immigrant talent to the United States. Many were intellectuals, capitalists, or bureaucrats who had held prominent positions in the deposed nationalist regime and were forced to leave after the communist takeover of 1949. A few had gone directly to the United States immediately after 1949 or before, while many, many more fled to either Hong Kong or Taiwan before later immigrating to the U.S. a few years later, either to study or to start new careers there. And some were college or graduate students during the Chinese Civil War, and they found themselves stranded in the U.S. without a country to return to. But large-scale immigration from mainland China itself ceased when the PRC isolated itself from the world community during the Mao years. And so just like the first wave, the second wave was warmly welcomed at first. They came at a time when the United States needed and actively sought immigrant brain power as they entered the arms race against the Soviet Union. The U.S. federal government poured billions of dollars into universities and national laboratories to promote research and development, and the Chinese were often many of the beneficiaries of this. They entered our universities, our corporations, and our defense laboratories in large numbers, designing some of this country's earliest rockets, developing powerful drugs and medicines, and fueling the high-tech and scientific revolution. And in Silicon Valley and elsewhere, their contributions helped establish and maintain U.S. supremacy in the information age. Some became extraordinarily successful as Nobel laureates and CEOs and pioneers in their fields. But it wasn't always smooth sailing for the second group either. When the Korean War broke out, when American troops clashed with communist Chinese forces and reports surfaced of white soldiers being slaughtered, imprisoned, or tortured in POW camps, the Chinese in America soon became the bad guys, as the Japanese Americans had been a few years earlier. Reports soon surfaced of ethnic Chinese being physically attacked, their property vandalized. Some who were suspected of being communist sympathizers found their mail opened, their phone lines tapped, their movements shadowed in the streets. The U.S. government even considered incarcerating the Chinese Americans in concentration camps and allocated money to set up detention centers. Now, one person whose career in the U.S. was destroyed by anti-Chinese hysteria was Dr. Qian Huishen, a visionary Caltech professor of aeronautics and the subject of my first book, Thread of the Silkworm. During World War II, he had worked on many secret military projects resulting in the production of some of America's first military missiles. He was also a founder of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena. But during the McCarthy era of the 1950s, Dr. Qian was falsely accused of being a communist and possibly a spy, mainly because some of his friends at Caltech had belonged to a secret communist cell during the 1930s. And unfortunately for Dr. Qian, this accusation came when the U.S. was entering one of the most paranoid eras of its history. China had fallen to the communists, the Russians had successfully detonated their own nuclear bomb, and evidence suggested that the existence of a British and American spy ring that had passed atomic secrets to the Russians. And so soon many of the American people and the government began to feel that the universities were just being infested with spies. And so after 5 years of investigation and virtual house arrest in Pasadena, during which time the U.S. government did not find one scrap of evidence that Dr. Qian was either a spy or a communist, he was deported to China against his will as part of a secret swap for American pilots who were shot down by the PRC during the Korean War. And ironically, after being forced to return to China, Dr. Qian revolutionized the Chinese ballistic missile program and later initiated the design of the Silkworm missile, which was used against the American armed forces by Iraq during the First Persian Gulf War. And we hear much about the Chinese space program today, thanks to their successful manned space flight yesterday. Now, history would repeat itself once again during the third wave of Chinese immigration, which occurred after the U.S. resumed diplomatic relations with the PRC. Business boomed in China, and tens of thousands of Chinese scholars, as well as people of all socioeconomic classes, began to come to the U.S. But as I discussed before, the disintegration of the Soviet Empire and the rise of China as the world's second major superpower did raise concerns in this country that China would soon rival the United States. And it was about this time when new legislation was passed to make it difficult for many Chinese immigrants and other immigrants as well, to effectively compete with American-born citizens. The Immigration Act of 1990 introduced the H-1B visa program for highly educated and skilled immigrant workers, but restricted the time such visa holders could work in the U.S. to a maximum of 6 years. Critics of the program called it white-collar servitude or high-tech coolieism, because a disproportionate number of these H-1B visa holders were Chinese. And as the 1990s progressed, as I had discussed before, the U.S. government really feared that ethnic Chinese scientists would pass military secrets to the PRC. Since the past is prologue, we must look to history to understand how and why the Chinese and other groups face these cycles of acceptance and abuse. And I'd like to share with you some of my thoughts, theories, and conclusions. My research suggests that the driving forces behind racism is typically money and power, rather than just mere physical and cultural differences. The appearance of the Chinese, the shape of their eyes, the darkness of their skin, their black hair, did not offend most white people or bring out their worst xenophobic impulses until certain conditions came into play. And these conditions usually require a political or economic crisis. For example, the Exclusion Act emerged out of the Depression of the 1870s. The anti-Chinese witch hunts of the McCarthy years came after mainland China turned communist, and the most recent backlash against the Chinese in the 1990s grew out of U.S. concerns that the Chinese would fill the massive power void left by the Russians after the disintegration of the Soviet Empire. And the theme of crisis being linked to violence and the abridgment of human rights can also be found in my second book, The Rape of Nanking, which describes the mass rape, torture, and murder of hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians by Japanese imperial forces in the capital of China in 1937. As I tried to understand the root cause behind these atrocities, I studied other acts of genocide across world history, such as the Armenian massacre committed by the Turkish government and the Jewish Holocaust by the Germans. And these horrific acts all had certain elements that preceded them: an economic depression, the rise of a dictatorship, and a scapegoat. In order to consolidate their power, politicians often searched for a common enemy as a means to unite the people, and a minority group at home or a perceived enemy overseas would be scapegoated and sacrificed. And in these situations, the powerful would often exploit racism as a tool for social control, to preserve the position of existing elites, to hamper serious debate and analysis, and also to serve as a smokescreen to obscure larger and more serious social problems. And it's very easy, really, to see how this could happen. When people's jobs are at stake, when they feel threatened, they are much more willing to give up some of their personal freedom for greater protection by the government. But as history has revealed time and again, the choice to trade liberty for security is usually the most dangerous choice of all. According to the research of R.J. Rummel, a world expert on genocide, it's not the genetic makeup of a particular people, nor a particular religion, nationality, or political philosophy that causes people to kill, but rather sheer, absolute, unchecked power. What he found was that the more concentrated the power in the hands of an elite, the more likely that elite, regardless of its race, culture, or any other factor, will commit human rights abuses both at home and abroad and initiate war with its neighbors. And according to the empirical data on the subject, dictatorships and totalitarian regimes by nature are just much more likely to wage war on other countries and torture their citizens at home than democratic societies, because absolute power gives certain people the ability to act instantaneously on the dark impulses that lurk within us all. And the sinister nature of power and how it can be used to exploit racism is that all people can be trained to see differences that don't really exist at times, to hate people of another group as the other, even if they sometimes and often do belong to the same racial group. In the case of African American slavery, plantation owners could be trained to view even their own children as chattel, subject to rape and incest and murder. In the case of the rape of Nanking, as I discussed earlier, it didn't really matter that the Chinese and the Japanese really belonged to the same Asian race. The real problem was not racial differences, because they didn't really exist between the Chinese and the Japanese, but rather an authoritarian environment that concentrated in the hands of a few people in that society and did not respect human life. Now, racism was definitely brought up within that society to try to justify atrocities. And during an intensely militaristic period created by an economic depression in Japan, a period of political instability, and a belief that these problems could be resolved through the conquest of Asia, the Japanese soldier was taught to believe, first as a schoolboy and then later through military training, that the Chinese were subhuman, almost as if they were another species. And to numb their hearts of any feeling of human pain, Japanese soldiers were sometimes ordered to engage in killing exercises, such as the bayoneting or beheading of live prisoners of war. So even murder would become banal and routine. But I do want to point out that in this culture that disregarded human life, even Japanese life was not exempt from this process of dehumanization. One former Japanese soldier said he was trained to believe that the emperor was a force greater than God and that next to him all human life was meaningless. He believed that loyalty was as heavy as a mountain, his own life as light as a feather, and that the greatest honor for a soldier in war was to come home dead. So then, what really is the solution to such acts of violence and genocide? The solution, according to Rummel and other experts, is to diffuse power through education and democracy. Grassroots political activism serves to hold leaders accountable for their actions. And education and public access to government information can enable the masses to make informed decisions about their elected officials. Democracy must be championed not as some abstract ideal, but as an actual preventative measure against atrocity. The story of the Chinese in America is largely a story of how one group met these challenges to democracy over time. And like any story, it is filled with failures and triumphs, of times we could reflect upon with pride, and other times that we would prefer to forget. But we must never forget, lest we repeat the mistakes of the past. Now, contrary to popular belief, the Chinese were active participants in this process of democracy and were not passive victims of injustice. And what isn't commonly discussed in history textbooks is that the Chinese Americans fought back time and again using the techniques of Martin Luther King or Gandhi even before they existed, passive resistance, nonviolent protests, petitions, boycotts, and court hearings. There was amazingly little violence that you would expect from a group that had experienced such legal discrimination and even systematic slaughter in some regions. They went to the law, they used the law, and they fought for their rights. For example, in the 19th century, during the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, they peacefully organized a labor strike against the Central Pacific, demanding higher wages, fewer hours, and an end to whippings by white foremen, and they succeeded in winning a few concessions. In the South, where post-Civil War plantation owners had toyed with the idea of replacing black slavery with Chinese labor, the Chinese hired interpreters to negotiate their contracts and sued their employers if they violated them. They also sued white schools in California and elsewhere that refused to admit their children. They helped organize boycotts in China of American products to demand better treatment of Chinese immigrants by American authorities. They also pooled their resources to hire the best white lawyers and lobbyists of the day to overturn some anti-Chinese laws. And it was a struggle that helped lay down the foundation of civil rights law to the benefit of human rights activists several decades later. For example, Yick Wo versus Hopkins set the standard for equal protection before the law, that any law applied in a discriminatory manner, whether to U.S. citizens or foreign aliens, is simply unconstitutional. Wong Kim Ark versus the U.S. upheld the principle of birthright citizenship, which would prevent American-born non-white people from being stripped of their citizenship and relegated into a permanent foreign underclass. Now, many of these anti-Chinese laws disappeared from the books after World War II, but the Chinese remained politically active. For example, during the civil rights movement of the 1960s, Chinese-American students staged sit-ins and demonstrations that forced universities throughout California, such as San Francisco State and Berkeley, to establish ethnic studies departments. And the program here in Santa Barbara is an example of some of this activism. Since the 1980s, Chinese Americans held huge rallies and raised legal funds to fight hate crimes, such as the brutal murders of Vincent Shim and Jin Liu. And Chinese American scientists in recent years engaged in a successful boycott of the national laboratories after the U.S. government engaged in illegal racial profiling tactics in the Wenho Lee case. So many of the legal protections and rights that we Americans take for granted today are the direct result of countless lawsuits filed by the early Chinese in the United States. But there were times when the Chinese community failed. For whatever reason, they failed to prevent the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act, the repercussions of which are still felt today when you consider that they lost almost a century of large-scale immigration. While other groups could come to the United States in large numbers and build up their political machines and infrastructure, since exclusion, the Chinese did not arrive in significant numbers until the 1960s, giving them a bare few decades to establish a foothold in the American political system. And some of the Chinese, I'm sorry to say, were not critical enough of the government in times of crisis when individual civil liberties of other communities were being threatened. For instance, during World War II, when Japanese Americans were being herded into concentration camps, more Chinese Americans should have spoken out and refused to wear those "I am Chinese" buttons that distinguished themselves from their fellow Asian Americans. And now the Chinese and other groups are facing a new challenge. As many of you know, the gains of a century and a half of activism are being challenged, if not wiped out, within a matter of months. The USA Patriot Act of 2001 and its sequel, the proposed Domestic Security Enhancement Act of 2003, threatened to destroy many of these hard-won American rights, such as our right to habeas corpus hearings, or even our right to retain our U.S. citizenship. Officials are also evoking the most shameful legislation from the past to justify present policies in the name of security. A few months ago, Representative Howard Coble, head of a Homeland Security subcommittee, shocked the Asian American community by defending the imprisonment of Japanese Americans in the 1940s. He said, and I'll quote him directly, "Some probably were intent on doing harm to us, just as some of these Arab Americans are probably intent on doing harm to us." Now, the Middle Eastern ethnic community has suffered great persecution since 9/11, in a manner that is greatly reminiscent to the persecution of Chinese Americans during the McCarthy era and the exclusion period. Now, people have been ordered off airplanes, they've been harassed, and they've been killed. There have been detentions without court hearings and deportations, and according to some of the human rights attorneys who are representing the needs of that community, some families have actually been fleeing from the United States as refugees into Canada. We stand at a pivotal moment in our history. The American people, not just the Chinese Americans, will have to decide whether they should trade liberty for security, whether they should place unquestioning trust in a government that wants to control the private lives of its citizens while throwing up a wall of secrecy around itself. My position on this matter is very clear and firm. These trends should not and cannot continue. You must leave options open for immigrants as well as the citizens. You cannot cut ethnic groups off from the law. When you do that, you're asking for outrage and mayhem and the flight of the best immigrant talent from this country. People need to recognize this not as an ethnic issue, but as a human rights issue. The dangers of racial profiling is that the government can use a divide and conquer strategy, suspending the rights of various groups one at a time until everyone suffers at the end. As long as any group is being scapegoated in American society merely on the basis of its cultural heritage, then none of us are safe. If there's one thing I've learned from writing my books, it's that democracy is not and was never a guarantee. It's still very much a young and fragile experiment. We cannot simply leave the difficult business of democracy in the hands of our elected officials, because governments will not relinquish or share power unless people force them to. And significant social change rarely occurs from the top down, but rather it percolates from the bottom up. So groups of all different races and classes need to reach out to each other, not turn within themselves. And to be effective champions of democracy, all of us have to be more aggressive in challenging the status quo. It means doing your part to the best of your individual preferences and talents to be heard. For some people, that means talking directly to our elected officials, educating them, and holding them accountable for their actions. For others, it means writing op-eds. For still others, it means going to public protests and engaging in acts of civil disobedience. We need to exercise our civil liberties and our civic duties no matter what the consequences. Now, it might seem that your individual deeds won't matter, but they will. They might halt the process of incrementalism, that when laws that will erode when laws are passed very quietly, one at a time, until people discover they have almost none left. These are some of the forces that enabled the enslavement of African Americans, the extermination of many Native American Indians, and also to the gross injustices committed against other groups worldwide. Let us not forget the immortal words of Edmund Burke: "All that is necessary for the triumph of evil is that good men do nothing." Unfortunately, too many people choose to give away their power. They choose to lose touch with their inner voices, their conscience, and their judgment. And I think in the end, the issue is often less of one of outright evil than more of moral passivity, of surrendering your power to a group or bureaucracy without any leadership or sense of direction. So I'm always inspired when I find a few individuals in the course of writing my books who buck the tide of social opinion and act on their own initiative. My job as a writer is to illuminate the struggles of these courageous individuals. I believe history is like a bank account, a giant repository of knowledge. We draw on the experiences of others in the past, and one day we will make our own deposits, record our own stories to the benefit of future generations. Many people have asked why I write and what it means to be an author and exactly what kind of writer I am. Since I don't have a title or affiliation with any organization, and I don't specialize in any one particular topic, I've often been categorized as a woman writer, an Asian American writer, a World War II historian, an aerospace historian, and so forth. All of these labels are correct, but they miss something significant. I think that in every writer there is a vulnerable spot that defines the themes of her work. And for me, that is the quest for justice. Justice not only for Chinese Americans, but for all Americans, in fact, for all people. On the surface, my three books, Thread of the Silkworm, The Rape of Nanking, and The Chinese in America, encompass different topics: World War II history, Cold War history, and immigration history. Yet they all have one theme in common. They fall under the rubric of human rights, an attempt to explore the causes of atrocity and the violation of individual civil liberties. They document the struggle of individuals against power, whether that power comes in the form of the Japanese Imperial Army, the Chinese Communist Party, or the American military-industrial complex. Which is why I want my third book, The Chinese in America, to be viewed not simply as an ethnic Chinese story, but as a quintessentially American one. My identity as a Chinese American derives its force from my duties, rights, and obligations as an American citizen, and the struggle to uphold American democracy, the struggle to protect the human rights and civil liberties of all Americans, not just Chinese Americans, is an ongoing struggle for all of us and our descendants and their descendants, rather than a job that is already finished and done. Thank you so much for your time this evening.